All right, I think we're live. This is Chris, and this is Journeys in Podcasting, and we are live at ITP during the ITP camp experience. And today we're going to be talking about many things, but how fabrics and weaving interweave into our own modern technologies. And we'll start with, who are you?
Hi, I'm Antonius Wiriadjaja, and I went to ITP and I graduated. I started teaching at ITP. Then NYU Shanghai opened up in Shanghai, and they needed more professors there, so I packed up. I was supposed to be there for a semester, and I started teaching this class on fabrics and how fabrics really shaped modern computing. And I ended up staying up to 2.5 years in Shanghai, just because it was such a good experience working with undergraduates, whereas here in ITP was working with graduate students.
Cool. So I was at your workshop the other night, and it was a 2-hour workshop where I would say 90% of the time we were actually weaving. And I don't know if I have ever weaved, but it was one of the most enjoyable experiences. And as we're weaving, I definitely look to the left, look to the right, a lot of dispersed knowledge going on in the room. You know, people were teaching others how to do it. Everyone's kind of really immersed in this experience. I was really surprised how how quickly we picked up at least the very basics. We looked at, simple machine work, using cardboard pieces to weave the pieces through faster, simulating weaving machines. I'm not saying the right word for
Loom.
that. Looms, thank you. You can see it's also very late at ITP. But what was really fascinating was the slides that you had up there, and as we were reading through, you gave us kind of the history of man and the history of how cloth came to be. And I would kind of ask you to repeat some of that, because it's a pretty fascinating story. And then we'll go into kind of how it relates to our modern technological world.
Sure. The slides I showed are actually 3 classes put into one. The beginning of every Talking Fabrics, I go over the history of fabrics and what it means to us as humans, because around the time that fabrics were invented, or there was proof of their invention, large number of things also came up. The idea of giving birth to younger and younger infants, and to also have evidence of things like funeral rites. The idea of culture started to appear around 100,000 years ago. And so there were evidence of things like fabrics starting to come up, which is, for example, the lice in our bodies started to separate. There were lice that existed in our heads, and there were lice that existed in our pubic hair, and they didn't coexist. They did not interbreed. So that's evidence around 100,000 years ago that we started wearing clothes. And around that time, we also started seeing things like funeral rites come out, and things like red ochre come up in funerals. So it's evidence that around the time that cloths came out, culture was also beginning to come out.
So with the physical act, not to be too simple, but with the physical act of weaving, at the same time they're weaving together culture, so to speak.
Sort of. I mean, actually, that's a really good point too. A lot of the metaphors that we use utilize techniques of fabric creation, because it was embedded so early in our culture that we tend to think that way. We tend to speak that way. So, for example, we weave a story together, right? If we follow a thread, and that's thinking about following a thread of thought, right?
You definitely got me on this, because a conversation I was having with my brother about this idea of the red thread. And the red thread is a term that appears in many different cultures, and it comes up with different kinds of significance. It really quite beautiful. One of the most beautiful ones is I don't know if it's a modern interpretation. The idea is like when someone dies close to you, your life is given a red thread, and you are like, not to say that mourning is not something you get over. Mourning is something you weave into your life, and you become different and you weave something different from there. That's totally tangential, but I'm fascinated by this idea that like it's so embedded in our being that it's in our language.
Even the word fabricate, that comes from fabrics. The idea of creating something, creation is creation of fabric.
Yeah. Wow. This is really cool.
Yeah, I've been studying this stuff for a while because originally my experience was in cognitive science. And in the cognitive sciences, we try to think about how people think and how people associate the world around us. And a lot of what I noticed was metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to think in metaphor, and a lot of the metaphors in which we describe story and history are fabric related. So that's what got me started in this stuff.
As you've gone around, I'm sure you've been drawn to I know you mentioned, I asked you 5 questions at once. I know that you talked to, I asked you who were the best weavers in the world, and you said the Peruvians, that they just had some of the most intricate work, which must not be coincident that their stonework as well is like, no one had produced the kind of stonework that the Incan Empire produced, for example.
Yeah, that's very true, but actually a lot of the techniques that the Peruvians are using now are not so much appropriated because they were brought there. They were brought from other cultures. So spinning and weaving were brought from Asia, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the Peruvians created their own methods, and they're actually very intricate and very beautiful. I mean, it was very early on that they started doing this stuff, but the techniques that they are using now that I'm saying I'm very interested in are actually from other cultures, and they've taken it and created their own.
So early man or earlier civilizations, they didn't just produce things kind of for the fun of it. Like artifact all was embedded in meaning. It was woven into society.
Yes.
When you study early artifacts of weavings, are you also studying evidence of how this was part of their spirituality, how this was part of their making sense of the world, how this was...
none of it actually exists anymore, because the fabrics of early man were created from organic stuff, and organic stuff decompose. The evidence that we have are the tools that they had. So we know that they not only used tools very early on to create thread, they also took good care of them. So we still have lots of evidence for it.
So I read the book The Hand a few years ago, and one of the eye-opening parts of the book to me was that the hand was catalyst for the brain, that the brain developed because of the hand's ability to start throwing things, and that society could actually develop because all of a sudden the hand could be, could make tools, could hold tools. Is there any evidence that weaving also holds a parallel there, that weaving predates other forms of social organization, or is it a product of these things?
I wouldn't say weaving, because weaving actually takes a lot of skill. It takes a lot of effort, and it's a technology that probably came a little later in the creation of fabrics. I would say that probably the first fabrics were felted together. Excuse me. Because we started domesticating sheep, and probably they were domesticated because of food, but also they happen to have really good wool, and when you press the wool together and they're wet, they make fabric. So it just is a win-win for everybody, right? So the sheep can live a little longer because we share them and we have their stuff to wear, and then they probably got fat and we got to eat them.
Well, let's jump forward and then we'll come back, because you're we're gravitating towards the more current. Here we are at ITP camp. You opened your talk, or somewhere at the beginning you said, oh, this is the perfect camp activity because we're all going to sit around and weave. And yet you also talked about how weaving has a nice parallel with programming, that zeros and ones are the basis of all programming, and basically weaving is built on the same logic. You either poke in or you poke back out. So how do you feel like these two are coming together? Is it what's going on there? Physical computing and ancient weaving.
It took Sometimes it's I am working with a lot of undergrads, and sometimes they never heard that metaphor before.
Mm-hmm.
They never heard the idea that computers all started from fabric machines that created fabrics are looms, right? And the idea of a loom is to allow you to pass a thread on warp threads, and they have to go up, down, and that's the most basic thing, right? 0, 1, 0, 1. But then some of the people who started doing that, maybe they got bored, or they got interested and they got curious, they started realizing something. Wait, I don't always have to be 0, 1, 0, 1. I can be 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and the one above that can be 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0. And guess what I created? Denim. I just created jeans, So that's programming in a nutshell, really, like seeing how you can change the variable and seeing the result. If I do this, what will happen, right? And it's interesting to me because, then we go into the world of Jacquard looms, like Jean-Marie Jacquard, the famous guy, mathematician, created this really cool, intricate machine. And not only are you able to go 1 and 0, all those 1 and 0s can mean something else. It can mean red thread, it can mean blue thread, it can mean green thread. So suddenly we have the beginnings of binary, right? And we have the beginnings of the idea of programming. So that's pretty standard. I think a lot of people actually talk about this, but it gets lost sometimes. We forget that a lot of what we're doing right now, which is very high level programming, started off from the idea of like, how do we fabricate this thing faster? And that's really where it is. We wanted to make cloth fast because it takes a long time, like you did, right? And 90% of those 2 hours you spent weaving by hand. When we realized we could program machines to do it faster, we really jumped forward in time.
Wow. What about this idea that there are a lot that are trying to weave together? I hate to use it's a really bad pun.
No, it's just part of the metaphor.
But it's definitely part of the language. We're weaving together the old and the new cultures. Jiki is going to talk to us tomorrow, and she's working with. She's changing the whole kind of dynamic around working with circuits, and she's doing it with traditional materials, paper, and using copper tape. Not traditional material, but like using very basic kind of concrete materials. How do you feel about all this physical computing and traditional arts? How are they coming together?
I think a lot of people are interested in it for different reasons. My personal reasons are because, like I said, weaving is an art form of creating ones and zeros, right? Excuse me. And it used to be that was the only way we could pass down ones and zeros. So it used to be that the only way we could make sure our grandchildren know that what we went through as people is we wove it into our fabrics, and then those fabrics continue. It's actually, there's a larger study of this. So there are patterns all over the world, and a lot of them, what they show, rather than just pretty patterns, there is actually meaning in it, and it's genealogy. So unfortunately, with the advent of the industrial age and the creation of fabrics in the way that we're doing right now, which is very fast using machines, that's lost. We don't really have that anymore. We don't pass down fabrics to our children anymore. We just buy them on H&M, right?
Yeah, so who are the hot spots? I'm thinking of Bolivia, where there was still an intact tradition of some very ancient weaving patterns, and they were still being passed on. Who are the surviving weaving cultures around?
Yeah, and that's, I guess, why I'm interested in Peru and why I'm interested in Iran and I'm interested in Indonesia, because those are three cultures that not only have that strong tradition, they also are trying to keep it intact. Sometimes it's actually counterintuitive what's going on. So things like synthetic materials somehow get in there, or they are catering to people who want to buy this stuff, and that changes the way the fabrics are created too. So that's where it comes from me. I mean, like it's funny because everybody has their own reason. Some people have a strong relationship to crafts because of their grandparents. Maybe they saw their grandmother doing something like this, you know. And some people have a strong affinity to crafts because of this inherent need for us to use our hands, right? So it's very, very different. I don't know where the source is, but I notice a lot of people want to incorporate crafts. The problem for me, actually, as an academic, is very recently we've kind of tried to take away crafts from the idea of knowledge. A lot of what we talk about in academia is more fine art. And it's fascinating to me because crafts is kind of like a second-rate thing to study.
Yeah, or I'm not sure I'm saying his name right, but I was listening to Bunny Huang last night, who talks about how a lot of the artistry that goes into hacking into material things and breaking electronics apart and reconstructing them, basically the culture around Shenzhen, that a lot of this is threatened by their very growth. That when a middle class develops, there's all of a sudden this distancing from the making of things. That and then all of a sudden everybody wants to be a maker, and it's kind of this revisit to our instincts and maybe needs to create things and to assemble things.
It's true, yeah, actually.
So I guess putting that back into kind of like an academic environment, as a teacher, my response is more, the maker movement is very much about leaving this kind of maker space. Sometimes it can be from an angle of it must exist on its own, that making in itself is its own thing. Whereas my argument would be that, well, once upon a time, all these making of things were so embedded in culture that humanities, arts, religion, all of these things would have been all a part of the making of that thing. And so it's totally natural for us to also re-gravitate towards this anti-disciplinary idea that these things can be brought into serious study, or what we call the serious studies of reading, writing, science, and everything else, the disciplines, but that we have to make bridges for those disciplines so that it would be totally appropriate, for example, for some young students to be weaving something, but also to be reading and writing as they're, weaving through this lesson or whatever. And yet, we're so intent on compartmentalizing all of our areas of study that we forget that, we were all these makers at one point. Have you seen anything in academia, in universities, where they're trying to bridge through these things? Because right now the ITP program at Tisch is one of the gyms where it really encourages this anti-disciplinary thinking and brings in some of the old crafts and mixes it in with some of the very high-tech crafts going on.
Well, I guess I'll toot our own horn. I mean, IMA has been doing really well, and IMA is an undergraduate program that's based off of ITP, but I think it made a big difference that one of our founders was Marianne Petit, who is not just a maker in the context of ITP, but she also is a paper engineer. So a lot of her work was based off of paper, and she has a very popular class on making pop-up books. So the students got to create using paper, and it's so funny, right? Because you think, oh wow, these are undergraduate students, what are they doing with origami, right? But if you look at what MIT is doing with a lot of its nanotechnologies, is they're using the engineering structures that are found from paper folding and bringing it into nanotechnologies. So things pop up on their own, but they're on a minuscule, tiny nanoscale. And they couldn't have figured it out if people hadn't done paper engineering. People didn't do origami. So I think it's important, you're right, to have an interdisciplinary approach. We're right now kind of a unicorn, but I'm hoping that the unicorn will keep spreading and people will also make their own unicorns.
Do you think in this making, should we be looking for this metaphorical thinking where the making is, there's some sort of metaphorical connection to the other areas, to language, to, Because what I often see is that there's sort of tacked on activities, or they are they're kind of like used as the after product. Like, okay, you're gonna read and write, and then you're gonna make the thing. So you totally miss the mix of all of these different elements. How do you feel about that? Like, I mean, when we go to workshops here, it's very much about like the making of the thing. And there's some talk around the ethics of making. There's some talks around storytelling, but really it's in that narrative or in that deeper meaning that the making makes sense, does it?
I agree. I think that so for example, my favorite story of the Iliad is when it was actually Helen of Troy, right? So Helen of Troy and the other people in Troy, they're actually hanging out and watching this battle scene unfold in front of them, right? And Homer is writing it in poetry because we're reading this. And then Helen goes and weaves, and she weaves the story into a woven tapestry. So it's interesting to me because Homer's writing is poetry, and that's how he expresses, but Helen is weaving, and that's how she expresses.
Oh.
And unfortunately, weaving doesn't last, right? Because organic materials decompose. So after the fall of Troy, probably we don't have that, right? But the stories do pass on, and then it got to Homer and the Greeks, and they started telling these stories. So it's interesting to me because actually weavers also wove that story, and they wove that story very well in tapestries, but we don't appreciate the tapestry as much as we appreciate the poetry of Homer.
It's like the perfect transmedia, transcoding experience where everything is embedded with narrative.
Right.
Or that different things could spark that narrative, that all, I was just reading Barthes lately, and he talks about how every object can become a conversation, that everything can spring forth words, and sometimes, you know, a simple statue, painting, tapestry could be hours of storytelling.
Exactly, and it's actually up to us to make sure that that continues. So I think that's why I also with you don't like when things are just tacked on last minute, as like, oh, we're gonna do reading, writing, and making, right? But making, I mean, writing is an important part of making.
Yeah.
In the idea, you know, the concept of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm totally with you there. In fact, working with kids, the beauty of any sort of communication system that is not text. So anything you can do with body expression, anything you do with making something that is literally part of the whole process, so that, you know, what gets you interested in a topic of writing might be an object, or it might be cloth, or it might be something physical, or it might be an image, and that can be the metaphorical thinking or sparking the thinking that, you know, launches your next reading and writing unit. So just like creative ways to embed that back into a learning experience. Let's shift gears for a second. Tell me about like conductivity and how conductive fibers have been out for a few years now. What's some of the interesting work you've seen with this?
I go over the history of conductive materials because largely they're new. They're new to the idea of making. They started because we needed sutures. So there were these medics, right? And these medics had to sew people up. And sometimes you don't have antibiotics on the hand, you know? So you use silver because silver is a natural antibiotic, and silver-coated sutures were what they use. Now, these silver-coated sutures are also conductive, and they figured this out because you could also pass electricity through it. So there were very intelligent people who were in the medical field who were using this material and also knew about electricity and electronics, and they realized, wait, I can create an antenna, I can create a trace, or I can create a thing that turns on an LED, a button, you know, by using this material, and that's what brought it over to the world of making. So once again, the importance of interdisciplinarity, because if those, you know, if those people who were studying medicine didn't also know the idea of electricity and didn't also know the idea that there were people who were trying to make stuff, this wouldn't have happened.
So, very hot topic this month. Shenzhen is highlighted in Wired Magazine's documentary of Cities of the Future. And there's a 4-part series. Bunny Huang appears in there. He's the guide for the whole experience. And I know you mentioned that you've been there as well, or I believe.
Yeah, I've been to Shenzhen, yeah.
Toured factories. How does all of this, what I think I'm trying to slowly understand is how we're here at ITP working with the deconstruction of all things. And as you deconstruct machines, as you deconstruct threading, you also have to start thinking about how this fits into the larger system of where all these materials come from, of where these things are made, of where our electronics come from, of how things get assembled, how business happens in Shenzhen, of how those materials come from Africa or children cobalt miners. I mean, like how it literally threads around the world, how all of this works. What were your experiences in Shenzhen, just in the factory experience there? Have you gone on purchasing ventures?
So my experience personally is I knew that 3M were doing really, really interesting stuff with these technologies. For example, they created Velostat, and Velostat's the most wonderful thing for me because it's a piezo-resistive material. And I looked into it and I researched it and I wanted to know how they created it. And turns out that there are a lot of factories in China making this up. And when I went to the factories, I noticed that there were only about 20 people working to actually run the machines. And the bulk of the people working in these factories were working R&D, research and development.
Wow.
I would say the ratio was 10-1, so 200 engineers to 20 workers. And you could even see that the workers weren't even working that hard. I saw, I don't know if I showed you the photos of the factories, but there were a lot of empty spaces. There were a lot of badminton nets. They were taking a lot of breaks because you make it and that's it, right? You ship it off. Then it's up to the R&D people to figure out what's next.
Are they contract hiring, like for projects? Do they pull in workers just for this month where we have this thing to go? You know what I mean? So they,
yep.
Is that kind of how it works?
Yes. A lot of the creation in these factories were done, and then, Chinese New Year happens and they stop. So
I think what you're getting at is that if they're moving towards more R&D model, then it's just it could be a very blink of an eye before they are the creators of these technologies.
It's already happening. There's a lot of new technologies that are appearing. I mean, they couldn't have made the phones that we have now so thin unless once again 3M had figured out that, oh wait, you can create this stuff from fabric, and fabric is smaller and pliable.
Wow.
There's actually a lot of fabric inside of your phone.
Yeah. Wow. Where else is there fabric?
A lot of the materials that are smaller.
Yeah.
And a lot of the materials are flexible. I mean, not materials, a lot of the electronics are flexible. You have no choice but to use fabrics. That's the inherent property of fabrics.
I think the discussion we're going to have tomorrow with Jiki is going to be very much about this this process of you come up with your design, but if you really want to get it done, you go to Shenzhen.
Yes.
And you find who can prototype this thing the fastest, and then who can mass produce it the fastest. So these kinds of partnerships sound like they're like happening faster and faster. So I guess my question kind of is, a lot of the talk was around intellectual property rights.
Okay.
Well, no, and it's this giant moral issue of like, well, look, do we really want to defend this system where the small number of 20 to 30-year-old white men have all these intellectual property rights, and they're basically making all the money from the thousands of others that are working in that industry? How long before do you think that changes?
I think we can keep it up, as in the holding of the intellectual property, for as long as the lawyers are hungry. But the innovators in China and other countries are even hungrier.
Yeah.
So you're right, it's a race. Basically, it's really useless to try to copyright things in China because things happen so fast.
Yeah, the documentary walks us through all the different versions of the iPhone,
Right.
which was just amazing. And sometimes with tweaks that make it, better in some ways. I mean, it's pretty incredible what's going on, or at least what I got the blink of.
This is really out of my field, so I don't really feel like talking too much about it. But I will say that like the 3M people who hire these factories, they realize that these factories are also taking these and going further with it. So 3M actually sends people back into the factories being like, hey, what'd you find?
Wow. So we're getting sort of the maker culture from all ends, kind of the more formal design, people that make the plans for this nanotechnology, but then you're getting all the tinkering part of it, of Shenzhen tweaking it and changing it into, making it a better product.
Right, and actually the factory I went to, the manager of the factory was getting a master's in chemistry while he was managing the factory. So he's smart enough to know like where the future holds, and that's in the creation of this stuff, the innovation of this stuff.
Yeah. Really cool. Kind of mind-blowing. Cool. Well, what else? You mentioned that you want to write a book. Is this what the book will be about?
Yes.
These types of things?
I've been talking about it for way too long, but the idea of my class is called Talking Fabrics. The idea of communication through fabrics and textiles and the technologies, and going over the techniques and where we're going to go with it. Because one thing that might happen is a reinterpretation of what fabric is, and that might happen sooner than we think, because we're running out of stuff.
Yeah. Wow. Mind-blowing. Thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for asking these cool questions.
No, it's really stimulating conversation.